Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who's joining. My name's Tracy, Rector, and I'm the Managing Director of Storytelling for Tero Foundation. I am a 20-year veteran filmmaker, community organizer, and arts curator, and I'm so excited to be sharing this space with these wonderful panelists this morning. First off, I want to say thank you to Zoe Elton from the Mill Valley Film Festival, who is the programming director for creating this safe space for this conversation. And I just want to also say thank you so much for acknowledging the Indigenous people's land for whom Mill Valley gathers upon and works on, the Ohlone and Miwok peoples. I myself am zooming in from the traditional homelands of the Puyallup people, and land acknowledgements help to right the wrongs of untrue history, especially in what is now called the United States or North America. So welcome everyone to this roundtable. This is one of two centerpiece events that form part of Mind the Gap, part of Mill Valley's events. The theme this year is Politics of Now, how the pandemic and the global uprising are shaping the industry, and how the current time provides an opportunity to reframe the reality we have all experienced, in particular, centering the voices of those who have remained on the margins for far too long. Both the centerpiece events, Changing the Industry from the Inside, work in tandem together with building your own table and chairs. There's no one way to engage with the industry if you've been marginalized group, but broadly speaking, two distinct but overlapping approaches have been adopted by organizations that represent the interest of women, BIPOC peoples, and LGBTQIA people, and people with disabilities. Certain organizations believe that the industry is perfectible, meaning that it has the power and the ability to change. And these organizations, as such, invest their efforts in changing the industry from the inside. Other organizations prefer to focus their attention on building alternative networks, platforms, and ecosystems alongside the mainstream industry, in which their communities can flourish, create new power structures, and set their own rules. And many combine a mixture of both approaches to varying degrees. Through the experiences of individuals and organizations, the centerpiece events explore both of these options. Today's conversation will focus on those organizations, collectives, and initiatives who decide to build their own table and chairs and set their own rules, or as someone else said recently, build their own bakery using their own flour and bake their own bread. Today, we will be joined by, and we'd like to welcome the following guests. Guetty Felin is a Haitian American writer, director, and producer of both documentaries and narrative films. In 2016, she directed the first Haitian film to compete for the Best Foreign Film at the Academy, Haïti, Mon Amour, and was a Haitian producer of the film that was selected at Cannes in 2019 and directed by French filmmaker Bertrand Monello, Zombie Child. Second, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Crystal Chien, who is a documentary filmmaker with a focus on personal storytelling from underrepresented communities. In 2017, she co-founded Represent Media, a grassroots nonprofit based in Oakland that advocates for personal storytelling in documentary film and nonfiction media. And next, I'd like to introduce Maria Fortiz-Morse from behind the camera. Maria focuses on capturing the beauty, power, and courage of her subjects through observational cinematography. In 2016, Maria served as a principal filmmaker for Hillary Clinton's historic presidential campaign and was a cinematographer for the most watched digital ad of the campaign. She's, amongst others, an active member of Brown Girls Doc Mafia and a current fellow of Tero's Storytelling Filmmakers Program. Sarita Khurana is an award-winning film director and cultural producer. Her feature film, A Suitable Girl, had a world premiere in the 2017 Tribeca Film Festival documentary competition section and won the Best New Documentary Director Prize. Sarita is currently a fellow with the Center for Asian American Media, and she also works to advance equity and structural change in the film industry through her work with the Asian American Documentary Network. All right, everybody, thank you for your patience in those introductions. As we go around, if also you could share with us your pronouns as we answer the questions. I just want to make sure that there's equity in terms of how we want ourselves represented. The first question I have is, it's a bit of a statement and then a question. In public statements, the industry refers to itself in the plural we. In the minds of many, this we refers to a community of professionals with the shared interest of the greater good of the industry, i.e. we need more, we need to do more, we will include you, we have reached our goal of. Rather than focusing on that perceived mission of furthering the collective greater good of the industry at large, many organizations have instead opted to invest their energies in furthering the interests of particular groups, communities, and audiences. Could you all today walk us through the reasons why some organizations choose to adopt this approach? And if I may begin with Jennifer, the first in my circle.
Sure. I'm Jennifer Crystal Chien. I go by she, her. I'm also on Ohlone land right now. I can't necessarily speak to other organizations. I can speak to why several of us got together and then how Represent Media was formed. And I think that Represent Media does both, actually. We do both industry advocacy and we also do community building within underrepresented communities. And the motivations for them are a little bit different. And so basically, in terms of building your own table and why we do our own work is because we realized that the support that we needed as filmmakers, especially working on personal story films, which are not necessarily films about ourselves, but are films about individuals, families, communities that are not from a social issue perspective, but are really just looking at the totality and the wholeness of our lives. We realized that there wasn't a lot of support for the work that we were doing, and that the things that we needed, the resources that we wanted, we really needed to form and gather together and continue to support each other. So there was sort of this organic group of women of color that formed in Oakland around actually a organization that did screenings. And so we did rough cut screenings with each other, and there were other people involved. But basically we realized that we needed to sort of form our own sort of network and resource and support group. In terms of our, just very briefly, in terms of our industry advocacy, that's completely different. I think that's actually about bringing our perspective into the larger industry and influencing how people look at and talk about issues regarding equity, racism, white supremacy, about how resources are distributed in the field. So we actually think it's important to do both.
Thank you. If I may invite Sarita to comment as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarita Khurana. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm on Lenape land, known as Brooklyn as well. So I think when you understand that we actually live in a white supremacist culture where our voices have been systemically excluded, it's very powerful to have parallel and alternative spaces of resistance that develop our stories, our leadership, us as individuals. And so I think for BIPOC communities, for queer communities, disabled communities, all those communities that are often marginalized in our industry, like you can't wait around for the industry to change. You need to be able to define things on your own terms and nurture your own communities. And that's really the kind of place where ADOC, which is the Asian American Documentary Network, started from. It's an organization, it's a network of Asian and Asian American filmmakers that was started in 2016 by Grace Lee and Leo Chang. And I think, you know, it's one of the first spaces where we could really just talk to each other and kind of define some of those things on your own terms. You know, what do you want your stories to look at? Like mentoring one another and developing each other as leaders and making decisions for yourselves that are not always in response to sort of the mainstream structures. It's just that you don't have time just to only respond and develop yourself and your communities in that way. You need to do these things for yourself because the mainstream industry is just so far behind what we need as creatives and you know, in the world today. So I think that work is necessary. It has to happen in parallel in the hopes that the work that we're doing, that many of us are doing right here in our different organizations and as individuals, that everybody else catches up or things get integrated. So you have to have those kinds of spaces.
Thank you so much. I often meditate on Massager Lord's quote that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think that is certainly appropriate in this conversation as well.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, that's something that we all keep close to our hearts, right, as we do this work.
100%. And if I next may invite Guetty to the conversation and your comments.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And I go by she and her. And for me, I always think of Toni Morrison, who speaks of like white supremacy being a distraction to keep us from actually doing the work that we need to be doing. And as a mother of 2 Black sons, when George Floyd happened, and many more each time, it takes me to a place of being in a kind of like post-traumatic stress each time. And I have to really calm myself and say, okay, this violence is a distraction. What I'm seeing is constantly a distraction. It's taking me away each time. It takes me away from what it is that I'm focused on and what it is that I'm supposed to be doing as an artist, as a female artist, storyteller. And so I'm constantly like recentering myself, and not to find myself on the margin. I don't like to call myself as a marginalized person. I'm constantly recentering. And I'm not recentering from a place where people are dictating what the center is. It is my center. And Daughters of Tressie was born out of this just rage of creating a space of wellness as well for Black and brown female filmmakers to work on their projects without any distraction. For us to come together as a council of women, we're not a vanity project. I mean, we're all over the world, and it's in its infancy. And basically, I reached out to other women filmmakers that I know who are in different parts of the world. I'm fortunate to be able to travel with my films. And so I make connections with different folks in the industry. And I said to myself, what would that look like if we created a council of women who can just be there to support budding filmmakers in making their first narrative or their second narrative? Tressie Souders came to mind. She is our first Black female filmmaker to make a film in 1922 called A Woman's Era. And in hopes of making her second film, and never did, and eventually got completely her dream was deferred, and moved back to the Bay Area. And she lived a long life, but she worked as a domestic worker. And the statistics are dire. I mean, it takes a male 2 years to make his second film, but for female filmmakers, they say 7 years. And so she never got to make her second film. Julie Dash, who made the seminal Daughters of the Dust, is still trying to make another film that, for theatrical release. And why is that? And so Daughters of Tressie was born out of that, to support, to continue to provide a space to support filmmakers of color, female filmmakers of color, and also create spaces to promote their work and find new and innovative avenues of distribution, and not waiting for other, for the industry. We're not working against the industry or anything like that. We're just saying that there's been too many Band-Aid solutions of like diversity and inclusion. We'll include you. And and that resonates with me, that collective we don't even, we know who they are, but they don't know who we are. And so how are you going to include me if you don't know who I am? And so how do we include ourselves within our own ecosystem? That's what we're working with. And that's, for me, that's why when Temba talked about like building the table, and that was the theme of this conversation, I always talk about like building our own doors, because we're knocking on doors of other people that they won't open. And when they do open, we realize that, they don't really want us in the house anyway. So it's about building our own doors to our own home. So it resonates with me really deeply in building our own table. But it really is about creating our own system, our own ecosystem where we can thrive, but in wellness. Because if we're all traumatized by what's happening in, within the pandemic and the racial reckoning, we can't create. So how do we create spaces of wellness for female filmmakers? That's what I'm obsessed with these days.
Thank you for your work. And if I may offer too, I just truly appreciate that you've invoked our ancestor in that way. Because for many people have never heard of Tressie. And I honestly believe that those spiritual tools are available to us. And when we invoke that power, that is those are part of the building blocks of new systems, is understanding that we are the past, present, and future of all of our ancestors and all beings. And their work prior helps us today. So thank you so much. As an Indigenous filmmaker and a strong woman who's paving the way behind the camera, Maria, I would love to hear your comments.
I just wanted to say thank you to Mill Valley, to Tracy, and to everyone who is helping to organize this wonderful event. And Zoe, of course, Zoe Elton. I also wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge that I'm in San Francisco right now, which is Ohlone land, and also to acknowledge my ancestors who are from the Papil tribe in Cuscatlan, El Salvador, and that is on my father's side, and also to acknowledge that on my mother's side, I'm actually descended from the colonizers from the New England colonies, and to say that when I enter this space, I bring sort of a consciousness of both worlds, and it's really integral to my work, because I don't just see my work as being a profession, but I see it as really being a spiritual calling that is about healing. It is about restoration. It is about righting the wrongs and injustices of the past, and to really learn from the ancestors and to think about what is a way forward that is going to bring about healing in this very, very challenging time that we're in. In terms of looking specifically at the industry, my background, I'm not a leader of one of these amazing organizations, but I'm rather a participant, a very active participant of Brown Girls Doc Mafia, which is headed by Yabo Boyd. And I'm also a participant in the collective of women documentary cinematographers, which is headed by two wonderful women, Jen Gilliman and Alex Blair, here in the Bay Area, and also a member of the Documentary Producers Alliance. And I am on the labor committee in that particular group, which has been really wonderful. So during this time of COVID, it's been an opportunity for me to kind of work behind the scenes to help organize, in many ways in a very administrative way, around building what I would describe as resources for filmmakers who are emerging or even mid-career to be able to do their work in a more sustainable way, and also to understand kind of the deeper structures at play within the film industry, whether it be around film financing or being able to use a camera, or things like how to contracting points when you're signing agreements as a producer. And I think this work is really important, and I feel very lucky to be able to do this work, because so much of the challenge of being an independent documentary filmmaker is sort of the gap between this idea that you have of this story that you really need to tell, and then the very challenging practical sort of steps that you must undertake in order to get from being able to create your vision and making it real within the industry. And so I think one of the inspirations of this time of organizing and advocacy behind the scenes that's going on is really seeing how within different groups people are creating much better resources to self-educate, to self-empower, to self-encourage. And I know Brown Girls Doc Mafia in particular has an incredible organizational strategy, which is something called a resource folder. It sounds very simple, but very profound. Within the resource folder, women and non-binary people who are members can actually go and look at treatments, budgets, grant proposals of other filmmakers that have been successful. And in doing so, you can really get a sense of how to be successful. What does a really strong grant proposal look like that was accepted at Sundance? You have access to that. And that's something that honestly is almost, before Brown Girls, that type of information was almost impossible to get. And so through this resource folder as just one example, I really do think that sometimes something as simple as a library of access can actually be a revolutionary thing. And then just to close, I believe very strongly that what we as filmmakers really need to be focusing on, as filmmakers from marginalized backgrounds or underrepresented backgrounds, is to think in terms of accessibility. So like not putting any barriers between people who, to just make sure that there's sort of a free flow of information, to think about how to scale ourselves. So meaning using things like spreadsheets, databases, all sorts of, tools that can be accessed by many people. And also transparency, meaning there's a culture of secrecy in the film community, which I think can be really, in some cases can actually be dangerous if you don't really know someone's background or are they a good person to work with. And then also encouragement, just being there to encourage people through the tough times. And to echo what Guetty said, is also about self-care. That's like huge. If you have self-care, I think you can kind of power through even the most adverse situations through the support of your community.
Thank you so much. And when I think about antidotes to white supremacy and capitalism and corporate greed, I think about the power of sharing and shared wealth and resources. And here in Coast Salish territory, there's a saying that you're only as wealthy as what you give away. And I think that's something that we're seeing in this time of, global reckoning around race, or thinking through equity due to the pandemic, around health and access to resources, is that many communities are beginning to understand the power and the leverage of mutual aid and caring for one another, which is profound and beautiful, and so speaks to our cultural integrity as BIPOC peoples of, carrying one another through all sorts of survival experiences and shifts. And I just so thank you, Maria, for bringing up those points around transparency and caring for one another, because I think that's how we will truly raise each other. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of the pandemic and accessibility in these times. I've heard both people saying that, there's an opportunity for all of these systems to come crashing down, or to build new systems, or for shared creation of platforms. But also with art houses being closed and many of these spaces being oftentimes ways that we as BIPOC creatives have been seen and heard and uplifted, and shepherded towards different career paths. What happens when those spaces do not reopen? And so I think we're in this very interesting dynamic time where we're called upon to hold one another, uplift one another, share resources, build new systems. But then you have monster platforms like Netflix who are calling all the shots, or how do we get into those spaces and make those pathways when we are all separated virtually in this day and age? So that's a big question, and I would love to just hear your thoughts and opinions. And I guess lastly, I'll just say I Will Destroy You has been so interesting to follow, and her refusing to give up the rights to her stories. And I think that moment of resistance is just shaking up the industry.
Thank you for bringing that up, because Michaela is absolutely, she's become like a hero to me right now. And I think she was able to be so bold because she said she didn't want to play the same game anymore. Those games are not getting us anywhere. They're silencing us, they're erasing us, and there's a deliberate act of erasure. There's a deliberate act of refusing our stories. And I think, Sarita, you were talking about the types of stories that we want to tell, and it's not necessarily the stories that they want to see, but do we care what they want to see? And I think there's a point where we get to say, it is not about them. There are I go back to talk about the distraction. It is not about them. It's about us. And I'm talking about the collective us. You were talking about the collective we in the beginning. I'm talking about the collective us here, between Jennifer, between Sarita, between Maria, between yourself, Tracy. It is about us. And how can we create allyship between us? I'm not interested in their allyship. I'm not interested in the lies. I'm not interested in the false promises. I'm interested in going on offense and saying, how can we build our own ecosystem? And we've been doing it. It's not even like, how can we do it, but how can we come together as we are creating our ecosystem? I come from a place, I was born in Haiti, and Haiti is the first Black republic, and today we're still paying the price for that freedom. But we have decided that, yes, it is a price that we will pay, but we have to stay autonomous. We have to be sovereign. And Haiti is also the only country that, when it did take its independence, that gave the name of the indigenous tribes who lived before that. Haiti is a Taíno word, which means land of mountains. And so we recognize the space of our ancestors. And so we're constantly calling out to them to go back to the ancestor worship. And so they knew how to do this. They knew how to do this. They knew how to come together and create collectives. They knew how to do this. So we need to, step away from the noise and the distraction and the false promises, and really come back to the center of how did they do this, our ancestors. They knew how to do it. They knew how to form collectives. They were doing it way before, we were here, way before Hollywood came into existence. And so we have so much to learn from the past. And I say, let's not be distracted by what they're saying and what they're doing. I think I'm not into that anymore, really.
Jennifer, I'm curious in terms of the work that's happening in Oakland. There's been such a presence of pushing back against gentrification and all the layers of not only media industry, but just socio-political impacts. And I'm curious how you work your way through the distraction and the noise and create truly kind of grassroots responses to sharing story and telling story.
Sure. I think I'm really interested in this idea of place-based storytelling. Oakland is one of those places that gets in the news a lot, usually for, as you said, social activism, protesting, the Black Panthers, sort of through history, a lot of different sort of negative things, about, sort of crime, drugs, racial issues, things like that. However, a lot of those stories are told by people who aren't actually from or in Oakland. And so we have this phenomenon where there's a lot of people interested in Oakland and trying to still tell stories about Oakland, but are not actually in or from Oakland. And so I think that there's something to be said about we have a project that's called Retake Oakland. And it's literally about people who either live or work in Oakland, have a strong tie to Oakland, who are telling stories about everyday Oakland people, who have something interesting going on in their lives, but it isn't necessarily based around a problem that they're having. And so in this way, I think it's important to reshape our local narratives and to begin telling the stories that we want to hear and being able to tell them in ways that we understand. And so that we're not actually constantly facing media about ourselves that's actually alienating to ourselves, that's being told by other people about how they see us. And this is a huge challenge, actually, because I think a lot of the industry conditions us to think of even ourselves in the light of social problems. And there are a lot of really important social issue films that create change and policy change. And so I think they're very important. But we're conditioned to think of ourselves as, what am I in relationship to a problem? And I like to say that although we have problems in our lives, we are not problems. And so I think it's about changing that whole framing and looking at how to use place-based storytelling, where we're telling stories about our own local communities. We don't need somebody from outside to come in and say, this is who you are. It's about us saying, this is who we are, and this is what we want to say about ourselves.
I think that's so great. And just to bring it back to Michaela Cole and I May Destroy You, I mean, I also was really inspired by that series and her work, and I'm looking for a similar inspiration in the nonfiction world. Like, I totally agree with what Jennifer's saying, is in that often in the nonfiction space, like, what do we get funded for? We get funded because we are some kind of problem, or there's a crisis in our communities, or, so the whole framework around that is problematic. We don't get funded to tell those nuanced and complex stories about our own communities. We have plenty of them out there. But the landscape is just not there. And so, yeah, we can absolutely continue to create on our own, but we are facing immense challenges. I mean, I'm very worried about the streaming platforms and the corporate money coming into the nonfiction space. I think those folks are not even wanting to be part of these conversations. I don't see those folks at festivals. I don't see them coming to conferences to talk about the things that we are talking about, even as the documentary space is trying to engage in these issues now. There's a whole group of people that are missing, and I'm talking about, the corporate interests. I'm talking about the streaming platforms. And so I'm all for making our own stories and telling all kinds of those complex, nuanced stories, centering ourselves. But this other thing is still out there, and those are powerful systems.
Sarita, what are you noticing in terms of these streaming platforms? Again, I'm seeing and hearing kind of both, there's independent filmmakers who are having the most eyes ever on their work, and then film festivals and independent cinemas are folding, who are trying to, their best to host this work. And I don't have any answers per se, but I hear a lot of conversation.
I mean, I think it's in some ways it's an old story, right? Like we don't, the power structures, those in power, executives, like we don't have access to that. There are not many of us in those positions. And yet, they're taking up more and more of the field. They're taking up more and more of the space. And, they flatten our stories, quite honestly, most of them. I mean, not in Michaela Cole's case, because she is a very smart, intelligent woman and she knew how to get stuff done, right? But oftentimes they can take our stories and also flatten them or bring out the stereotypes about our communities, So, and it's a very individualized game. We're not collectively represented there. We have to compete against each other, right? Just to kind of have access to some of those spaces. Things we're not interested in doing. That's not collective power, right? That's pitting each other against each other. For, we do that now. We have scrappy resources now that we compete for. And so, I don't have the answers now, except that I do believe in collective power and how can we, individually, I don't know how much we can do, right? But collectively, we can speak to these things and demand accountability. There's a critical conversation right now about accountability in our industries and who gets to make which stories about our communities, and how extractive filmmaking just needs to stop, and we need to hold each other and, all those in power as well accountable for this stuff. Every once in a while, I imagine, what if we all walked out of the industry, right? Like, what if we just stopped making other people's work because we have to make a living? We all walked out and we had our own infrastructure, and we have some of those spaces in the organizations we're in and in the collective spaces. But, I think this is why, we need to keep building our own tables and chairs and houses and palaces and mansions and all of it, right?
Yeah, there was that conversation last year about what happens if we remove our Black and brown bodies from large festivals and attend Black Star, for example, and support festivals from community by community, because our stories are powerful and people want our stories. And how collectively can we choose to shift the power of where they are seen and experienced. Maria, I saw that you had a comment too.
Yes, I have many comments on this subject. This is actually something I think a lot about, so I'll try to be brief. But I share the concern with the power, and not only the power in terms of money, but also the power in terms of eyeballs for Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon in particular. I am thinking actually about we go back in time to when Mr. Rogers was testifying in front of Congress, and we're thinking about the formation of the independent television service, and thinking about when TV executives felt that they had an obligation to give a certain percentage of airtime to socially important stories, that I feel like we're falling away from that in terms of these big streaming players, and also in terms of YouTube and Facebook and social media. And it calls to mind this question that I think is an important one that we begin to talk about, which is at the policy level, what would be a strategy that we could advocate for collectively to mandate at the federal level that a certain amount of airtime or views or prominent placement in the algorithms we might be able to advocate for independent voices, and what would that look like, rather than curating based on the algorithms and what people want to see, which is oftentimes, let's just say, maybe not the most socially redeeming quality content. But for, I don't want to force someone to eat spinach. That's not, a great thing to do. But I think there are ways to advocate to say, look, we are a democracy. We have certain values. And one of those values is to have content that brings education, that is socially impactful, and that makes a better society? And what role can Amazon and Netflix, Hulu, YouTube play in creating a space for that? And if it's not voluntary on their part, which I would hope it would be, honestly, but if it were not voluntary, then could it be something that we ask our legislatures to do for us? And then the question would be, how do we strategically advocate for that, building alliances with people of power and influence in that world? That's one thought. On a much sort of more granular level, I think simply asking the executives who are known within the community from Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon to think about giving premium opportunities to directors from our communities to tell stories from our communities. I think that's really crucial. So if there is a story that the executive wants to tell for whatever reason, they saw treatment, they saw pitch, and they're looking for a director, we can do this ourselves, to have an easy way for them to connect with directors, to make sure these directors are, obviously very talented, and then to find ways to make sure that the directors are supported when they take on these opportunities from within the community, and also by the networks themselves or the streamers themselves. So I think just thinking strategically about that, and then when directors are hired to take on these particular, whether it's a series or a show or whatever in the documentary genre, to think about how can they hire crew. So thinking at every level, who are also from our communities, so that, for example, in cinematography, there are very, very few women documentary cinematographers at that level who are getting hired to film Netflix, Hulu, Amazon type shows, and even fewer women of color. So how can we create a pipeline so that women can start to get those opportunities to do this type of work? And I should say women and non-binary people. Yeah, so those are kind of my top of line thoughts on that.
It's so, thank you, Maria. It's so critical to think about our power collectively once again, and the shifts that can happen. And I reflect often on the movements that Imaginative Film Festival has made. They're based in Toronto, Canada. They're the largest Indigenous-run film festival in the world. And they are unapologetically Indigenous. And they have created manuals and guides and protocol books, and they are changing the industry inside out. So, everything from demanding from the public broadcasting to, have a certain percentage of content be Indigenous or an Indigenous language even, and just putting that out there in the ether and on the waves for people to experience and learn from. But they are also navigating and negotiating, for example, with Netflix and these big industry players. And in Canada, I believe Netflix just gave $26 million for the Indigenous film industry. And what's come from that is creating the Indigenous Film Commission. And so it's curious to me how you all think about, in terms of your organizations and individually, how do you feel about navigating taking money or not for change?
I think I'm kind of with Guetty in that I'm more interested in a conversation about building our own table. What does that mean, right? And it's not, there is a part of the industry that's about knocking on doors and opening doors, but that's the conversation about changing the industry, which in my mind I thought that was a different roundtable, but it's interesting how we kind of get sucked into having those conversations, because our orientation is always towards the dominant perspective. And I think that that's actually one of the biggest problems, with BIPOC filmmakers and people in the industry, is that we're always trying to reorient towards that dominant perspective. And I actually think that a lot of the work is about raising awareness and changing the language and conditioning ourselves to actually, what does it mean to recenter ourselves? It means that the root of what we do and the power of what we do comes from within ourselves and our communities. And from that point, it grows to a point where other people, what I think about it is that from my perspective and from our organization, we're not trying to convince anybody to do anything. We're not trying to knock on anybody's doors. What we're doing is building sort of our own flourishing garden so that other people feel attracted and feel like, wow, that's a beautiful garden. I'd like to go in and see what's happening there. I'd like to enjoy and sort of be a part of that wonderful environment that's been created. You know, it's not about us going to them and sort of saying like, okay, can you please let us into your garden? It's actually about like cultivating our own garden in such a way that there's no question why people would want to come and see what's there and participate and collaborate. So I'm not actually about trying to convince, you know, people at Netflix or anywhere else to do things for us. It's actually about, can we become sort of our own shining example of something that is so attractive that people can't resist it, right? And that's, I think, something that I started to see, especially when people started to do their own community screenings, was that those screenings would be sold out. There would be like 60, 100 people at these screenings. And had they gone to a typical film festival, maybe, you know, 15, 20, maybe 30 people would show up. But people are hungry for this content from their communities. People want to see themselves in media in a way that they understand. And this whole narrative that like, you know, oh, we don't know who the audience is or how to reach them is part of this dominant power structure. And so I actually think one of the biggest challenges is to start to reorient ourselves as the center of how we think about how change happens. And not about going to others, but attracting them to us, right? Because we have our own sort of shiny, wonderful, beautiful thing happening. And I think that for me, that's probably the biggest takeaway about what building our own tables means. It means valuing the beauty, the power, and the strength within ourselves, and having that be such a wonderful thing that people want to come to you and to be a part of that.
I think when we operate within a system that is dictating to us whether, you know, an audience will buy this or not, you know, and or that qualifies like, you know, the work that we do as urban because it's Black. I mean, what is that anyway, right? Put labels and the stories that we tell. I don't see what going to speak with those same people constantly to try to change the way that they view the world is going to give us power. It won't. And it's not about, you know, for me, it was never about like knocking on their doors and so on. When the pandemic hit, I remember I started to pen a letter to like Hollywood executives and speaking about how we're going to be the most vulnerable folks and so on and so forth, because now that the industry is tanking and then I stopped myself and I said, you know, I'm speaking to people who are not about change. It's too systemic for me to be, you know, like trying to like break down that door. You know, when you speak to like, you know, Hollywood executives, and I'm working on my second feature right now, and they say, well, you know, the barometer is based on whether, you know, the red states will see your film, basically. That's already a racist barometer. If it is about like the films that you are greenlighting is whether white supremacist, you know, bastions of white supremacists, you know, will like my film. I mean, that, you know, that kind of barometer does not fit with what I'm trying to do. And I do, and as much as I believe in advocacy and going to Congress and trying to make change, but we've gone down that road. I think we are in a groundswell of how this racial awakening is not only affecting us here in America, but affecting the world. In places like Italy, you know, like, you know, bastion of like fascism during like, you know, Second World War that continues. They're talking about like George Floyd being in their own country. I mean, in Germany, I was on a panel discussion 6 weeks ago, and it's a groundswell of what is happening. And I think we have to ride that momentum to say that there's more of us out there that are creating our own gardens. And how do we like go and visit each other's gardens and learn from each other, as opposed to trying to knock on the door and say, come and see my garden. Our garden can grow and be so much more beautiful that they will want to come and see it, as opposed to us constantly going to them and saying, come and look at what we're doing. We're constantly doing things. It's not working. We've been doing that like, you know, for centuries, you know, constantly asking them to come and, you know, look at us, look at us. Eventually, we need to be looking at us. We need to be looking at us, the collective us again. And I will, sometimes I repeat myself, but for me, it has become a mantra. And like, how can we together continue to create and tell stories that matters to us, not like to them. And it's not an us and them thing, it's really about us. I mean, them, they're out of my equation. It's really about us. And when I sit here in this discussion and I hear you all, I want to see everything that you're doing. I want to see like how I can interject myself and be a part of it and grow that. I'd like to introduce you to like budding filmmakers of Haiti who are finding their autonomy to tell their stories. They're miles away from Netflix, and yet they exist in an ecosystem that is working for them. So let's find those ecosystems that do work for the collective us. That's what I'm about. That's why I came to this panel discussion, not to figure out how we go and knock on Netflix's door and say, like, we have like all these stories, like you have to take and listen to our stories. Let's find ways for us to collectively finance and get behind those stories and collaborate with one another to actually get those stories out there, because our audience is there. It is ripe. It is waiting. And Tracy, the example you gave about the Festival of Indigenous People in March, it's because they were doing the work and they were working and collaborating with their audience. That's why now people think like they're all significant, but they've always been significant to themselves. And so, I will continue to say I'm more interested in the collective us than the we that I don't even know what that means,
That's so true. Imagine Native just unapologetically has always been Indigenous in protocol and approach, and is often shifting and is often remarkable because they know how to shed away layers, shed away what doesn't work, and try new things and approaches. What are the tools, what are the organizations, what are the peoples that you want to call into this space who are doing the work and creating new pathways?
Well, for me, I believe, I'm just learning about Jennifer's organization and Sarita. I know what you're doing, and Maria, and I know Brown Girls, Doc Mafia. I've also collaborated with them. I've had people reach out to me just for like small advice on a lookbook, for example. And I'm still like already, always willing to be engaged with all these organizations. I say let's not compete with each other, because that's what the powers that be want, to happen. They make tokens out of some of us, and then the next thing we're going in that direction. And so I believe in the collective. Daughters of Tressie is a collective. It's not a vanity project. We don't have like any. We don't have a website. I mean, we're building the website, but we don't have it yet. But we're still, effective. And I believe that if we are a collective that is out there with names of people, then people are attracted to us because we have these name people. And we decide that we're not going to be that. We're going to be like silently making a difference, and as a collective. And we work as a collective. And we've actually partnered with the Parity Project, which is all about accountability, and to think of what would a platform that was operated by filmmakers and storytellers in a sort of like cooperative, and to put the power and the money back into the pockets of those filmmakers. What would that look like? These are the kind of conversations that we're having. We're having conversations about autonomy, to not have to always constantly go to the big ones and create our work, but also finance our work, but also promote our work collectively. So there are many organizations that are out there that I really want to, you know, collaborate with and partner with, and as long as, you know, they want to, you know, their own autonomy as well, I'm interested in that. I'm not interested in collaborating with organizations that are trying to work within the system. The system is broken. I can't work within a broken system, and I'm not saying that, you know, that I am not collaborating with Hollywood, not at all. It's just that I cannot work and function within this broken system. And when you function within a broken system, it breaks you eventually. And there's just too much going on in the world to break us constantly every day to actually integrate a broken system at the moment. But so I'm interested in knowing what everyone is doing, and then we can, you know, like, believe me, I will be reaching out to each and every one of you. So get ready.
I would like to see some more attention on streaming platforms that are sort of built by and for us. And so, for example, there's a new startup called Sisterhood Media in Toronto that basically is, you know, getting the rights to shorts by different women of color and being able to have a subscription basis to sort of stream on their website. There's also, I think, a little more well-known is Open TV. That's done by Amar Jean Christian. So I think that these are really viable platforms that we need to invest more in and have curiosity about and really support and think about what does that mean to sort of, you know, those platforms can't replace a thing like Netflix, but they certainly are able to be part of that garden that grows, right? So, you know, part of that ecosystem that we create that can support filmmakers in getting their work out there to audiences who are interested, that we know are there, and, you know, sort of building, you know, building that environment for the work to flourish. And so I'm kind of curious why we don't have more conversations about those kinds of platforms.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think the platforms are absolutely important. I think, and building our own, I think nurturing within our own communities and developing our own leadership skills, developing emerging filmmakers, and developing leadership in our communities is critically important. I mean, we're not going to necessarily get that, you know, from out there, but what our organizations have done so beautifully for decades, you know, for decades, we've been doing the work of presenting, you know, alternative, beautiful narratives about our communities. We've been nurturing the growth of, you know, filmmakers in our communities. And I think we need to keep doing that. I mean, some of the people who've come out of community-based spaces, you know, film spaces are in those positions of power now. And, you know, you hope that makes a difference, right? That they take what they've come up from and can advocate in those other realms. But in the meantime, I think, you know, we're doing a lot of critical work where we continue to nurture, you know, like I wouldn't be a filmmaker if I didn't have, you know, a space back in the 90s, which was a South Asian women's creative space, you know, that my friends and I started, right? And it was, you know, similar to Jennifer's organization. Like, you have to make those things for yourself because they didn't exist, right? And I wouldn't have known that I could be an artist. I didn't know I could be a filmmaker, you know, and unless we had those spaces, like, I couldn't imagine something like that. And so I think we need to keep doing that for ourselves and for others in our community, young people, emerging filmmakers. Like, I think that's really critical work, because you're not necessarily going to get that validation and support from outside. And you know, I want other filmmakers to come up in a space where they aren't thinking about getting their films on Netflix and what it takes, but they are thinking about, you know, what's nuanced and complex in my community? What stories do I want to tell? Well, how do I want to see, you know, myself represented out there? How do I want to, you know, what's missing in this media landscape, and what stories aren't being told that I know should be told, you know, and not define themselves like everyone's saying with, you know, whatever this bigger structure is. You know, I am really inspired by this conversation to remember our centers and heal ourselves, you know, and continue doing that creative work. And giving back. I mean, that's what we do, right? In our communities, we give back and we keep building.
Thank you for the reminder about the importance of the next generations and young people. I absolutely love, just to call into this space, Youth FX and Next Doc, which are based in upstate New York, and it's co-led by a South Asian person and a Black person. And their interests are in equity, representation, but also just breaking down norms and building new tools to build a new structure. And so just thinking about future generations and the great work that's happening in some of our youth-led and youth for youth organizations in this space. And Maria, we will be giving you the last comment because we are just 5 minutes from our time. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Just wanting to continue what's being said is that I think in imagining the future of what we can do, it's important to begin to think, to really come together in our communities to begin to articulate in a strategic way what it is that we want to be doing, whether it is, you know, creating new platforms to share and showcase our work, whether it's supporting more local community festivals so that we can get our work into like where we are making our work, like returning it to the community where we're working. And also to think very much about who is doing this work successfully. And I would again, you asked about who is doing this. I am thinking about Amar at Open TV is doing really amazing work right now. He stands out. But there are many other people as well who are maybe doing this still in its infancy. And so being able to draw people together to amplify their work and to have this an organization behind it or organizing behind it to strategize, because I think oftentimes if you're not connected, you can kind of be having to reinvent the wheel many times and spinning unnecessarily. So how can we be more efficient, conserve our time and our effort so that we can just put it into strategies that we know are going to work. And then also to, whenever possible, to amplify each other's voices so that funding doesn't just go to one, but goes to many, and to let people know that this need is a great need and a very worthwhile cause to be supporting either with time or with philanthropy. I think that's really critical. And I just want to say that regardless of who comes to support or not, that this idea of creating a garden that is so incredibly, you know, garden of stories that are so incredibly powerful and attractive, that I think that really is it. It's like, instead of trying to cater to a framework that wasn't designed for us in telling stories that come from us, there's no permission needed. There is no gatekeeping needed. There is no sort of ticking certain boxes needed. It's entirely coming from one's own authenticity of one's own experience, of one's own drive towards telling really powerful, excellent stories. So that's my closing thought.
Thank you. And actually, there is a last question that I was asked to present as we wrap out of this space together. And it's along those lines of radical imagination, Maria. And it's about, you know, let's future trip together and plant some seeds and quickly talk about, considering we're close to time, what would your organization or your work look like if it achieves your objectives and surpasses them?
I think if we were to apply radical imagination, what I would see with our BIPOC filmmakers is a lot more fun, exploration, joy, a lot more just openness, I think that right now we experience a lot of struggle. And so I think in an ideal world, filmmaking would just be, not that it wouldn't have challenges, but that it would be, it express more of our joy in bringing ourselves to this work and engaging in this art.
I think for me, when I imagine what the future of filmmakers of color telling their stories, it's within a space that is totally free, and where we're not worrying about whether people will like our stories or not. Creating from a space of joy, a lot of joy, a space of love, and thinking collectively, thinking about our stories within the larger pantheon of stories that resemble us, and in reaching out to other communities who are doing the same. I see us working in a space that nurtures, in a space that each one teach one, that we continue this collective work through our own, like giving our time, and also Maria mentioned philanthropy, and philanthropy does not have to be like you're making this huge donation, but what do you have? What can you bring to the table? And continue growing the table, with other radical groups that are doing the same things that we're doing. We're not reinventing the reel. We're just making a bigger reel. And yes, that's the way that I imagine it, in having that collective garden and growing the garden and getting seeds from other gardens, and continue.
Thank you, Guetty. Maria, I see your mic is off. Would you like to comment?
Yes. I would say, from wearing my hat as a cinematographer, radical imagination would be literally that like half of all documentaries are being filmed by women and women of color, and non-binary people of color. Like that would be incredible. I think that we are I think one of the challenges specifically for cinematographers is that we just don't get hired as frequently. So we have to do other types of work in order to supplement trying to be a documentary cinematographer. So I would say like, it's kind of simple, but just regular, consistent work and opportunities to hone our craft, depending on what level we're at. That would be amazing. And then being able to work for BIPOC directors, that would be incredible, so that there is enough of resources and opportunities to be able to do that work consistently, and to really be taking creative risks in cinematography, and being known for creative excellence in the sort of visual strategies that we deploy as cinematographers. I think that's sort of my radical vision for the future. And then for directing, I think I just would echo what others have said. It really is just a matter of this vision of our stories being the center of the paradigm, rather than something that's not our own, and having that be really powerful and flourishing. And I actually do see that. I see that work happening now. And I just want to affirm that is happening now, and that's really beautiful to see. And anyone, who is watching this, who might not be familiar, definitely check out the amazing women who are here, and the work the organizations are leading, and also the members of Brown Girls Doc Mafia. Learn more about that organization, and the fabulous work that it is doing.
Thank you, Maria. And Sarita, we will end today's conversation with you.
Well, I think my friends on this panel, we've all said so much about what that radical future can look like. I think for ADOC, which wants to support the visibility of Asian and Asian American filmmakers, if we were able to achieve all those goals and aims, like, you know, does there need to be an organization like that, right? Can we have a plurality of storytelling? Would there be new kinds of storytelling structures? And would there be such a diversity of stories from all our communities that, you know, it wouldn't be like, oh, this is just an Asian American story or a Black story or a Latinx story. There would be stories that would be connected very specifically to our cultures and our communities, but, you know, we'd also value them for their universality and humanity. And I don't know, I think it would be inspiring to look at, you know, be inspired by the diversity in all our communities, you know, and yeah, it would be nice to have a time when we could have those gardens and we all didn't need to be spending time doing this work for equity and can just tell our stories and collectively be together.
Well, thank you, everyone. And it feels good to end with some laughter and joy as we move forward in this work and in this healing work that we are all doing as creatives in this moment in time, carrying all of our ancestors together with us. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you, Tracy. Yeah.